Welcome back. I'm Muggsy, and today I'm going to explain bryophytes. Because why not? Okay, so your first question is probably, what the heck is a bryophyte? Well, phyte is Latin for plant, and bryo is Greek for moss. So basically we're talking about the mosses and related plants. In particular, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Now these might seem like really strange, obscure things, but in fact they're really interesting, they're really important in the evolution of plants, and they're still around today in great abundance and doing all kinds of weird, crazy stuff. In fact, the whole reason I made this video is because yesterday I was walking in my local park and I looked down and I saw that these things were everywhere. I could see moss everywhere, I could see liverworts everywhere, which is a little unusual. I'm not used to seeing a bunch of liverworts. That's kind of what got me interested in the first place in making this video. So I went back, got my camera, took some footage, and then decided to make a video about it. So let's talk bryophytes. Bryophytes are non-flowering plants. They don't have flowers, they don't have seeds, and they don't even have vascular tissue like the xylem and the phloem. Now, vascular tissue basically enable plants to grow up. And so bryophytes are all found kind of crawling along the ground. If you've ever seen mosses, you'll know that they don't grow to be hugely tall. They just kind of grow along the ground. They also need water. So bryophytes are typically found in wet areas and during the wet time of year, which where I live, that's the spring and the fall. Right now it's the fall, so these things are growing like crazy everywhere, and in fact people are trying to keep them from growing, especially mosses, on their roofs and places like that where they don't want them. So let's talk about the evolutionary history of all plants on Earth and where bryophytes fit into that history. We're going to go kind of deep on this because what's the point of explaining something if we don't explain it thoroughly? I'm going to give you some dates. Just know that these are scientific approximations. These are based in many cases on fossil evidence, in some cases kind of sketchy fossil evidence. So it's the best that we know as of right now when I make this video. In the future, these dates could all change, obviously. 3.5 billion years ago, or 3,500 million years ago, we saw the evolution of bacteria that could do a form of photosynthesis that doesn't require oxygen. We call that anoxygenic photosynthesis, and it's performed by these anoxic bacteria. And they use compounds such as hydrogen sulfide to do photosynthesis instead of oxygen like later organisms. A little bit later, 3,100 million years ago, or 3.1 BYA, we saw the evolution of organisms that could do true photosynthesis. These are blue-green algae bacteria, blue-green bacteria, sometimes called cyanobacteria, and they live in the oceans, they live in lakes and rivers, and they can do photosynthesis with oxygen. And so once these guys took over, we saw oxygen absolutely everywhere on Earth, and then we saw the evolution of other bacteria that could take in that oxygen, such as like what we do as humans. And then much, much later, 1,500 million years ago, we saw the evolution of our first eukaryotes, organisms with a nucleus with membrane-bound organelles, and something that can do photosynthesis but is a eukaryotic organism instead of a prokaryotic organism is an algae. An algae can be one cell big, or they can be giant, like a bull kelp or big forests of seaweed. And so algae kind of exploded everywhere, and just these groups of organisms, cyanobacteria, algae, produce a massive amount of the oxygen we still breathe today. The problem with these guys is they can't live terrestrially. They need to be submerged in water because they have no way of kind of long-term storing water or gathering up water through things like roots. And so there's this kind of huge amount of area that is unused right now. The land has no plants on it. It's basically just bare rocks. The next thing that would happen is some organisms would figure out how to live on land. And about 475 million years ago, we see the first evolution of land plants. And this is when we see our bryophytes. Mosses, liverworts, hornworts.
And there's basically two main innovations that really enable these bryophytes to colonize the land. The first one is the evolution of this waxy substance on the exterior of the plant that we call a cuticle. This is critically important. Algae are just kind of saturated in water, so they don't need to worry about this. But if you live on land, sometimes there's water and sometimes it's dry. And if your cells are just exposed to the elements, all the water in your cells will evaporate and the plant will dry out and die. So these mosses and liverworts and hornworts evolved this waxy cuticle to kind of seal that water in, to act as a barrier to transpiration. With later flowering plants, you can really see a thicker cuticle evolve. And if you've ever seen water just kind of bead off a leaf, you're seeing a good example of this waxy cuticle. The second thing that enabled these bryophytes to colonize the land is the evolution of root-like structures. We call these rhizoids, rhizo for root and oid for like. If it's humanoid, it's kind of like a human. If it's android, it's something that's kind of like a man. A rhizoid is something that's kind of like a root. It's not quite roots. It's not specialized like roots. They're not particularly good at absorbing water and nutrients and that kind of stuff. But mostly what they do is they anchor the bryophyte to whatever medium that it's growing on. So it anchors them to rocks and to soil. Later on, when trees evolved, it would anchor bryophytes to trees. Critically important, because if you don't have these anchors, your cells would just kind of blow around, or if the stream rises or if there's a flood or a big rain, they would just be washed away. So these anchors allow the bryophytes to kind of climb up onto the land and colonize a massive portion of land that was previously just barren.
Now, these are land plants. They have the ability to kind of contain a little bit of moisture and store it in their cells and specialized organelles, but they don't have vascular tissue, so they can't grow tall. They can't really thrive in an area without a lot of water. So even though these bryophytes can live on land, they still need to be in moist areas. So rainforest areas, areas with a lot of humidity, swamps is a place where you'll find a lot of bryophytes, along streams, those sorts of areas. There still would be a huge amount of the land uncovered at this point. The plants that would really take over are plants with vascular tissue, which is our next big innovation. About 420 million years ago, now we're kind of running out of space, we see pteridophytes. And the big thing that happens here is vascular tissue. The xylem, which transports water throughout the plant, and the phloem, which transports sugars and other compounds throughout the plant. The most common example of a pteridophyte is a fern. So ferns have vascular tissue, they can grow tall. In some parts of the world, you can see ferns that are huge, tree ferns, like in New Zealand. I saw some really big ones in Hawaii. And back when there weren't other plants, when there weren't flowering plants and there weren't gymnosperms, ferns would have been kind of covering a huge amount of the planet. In fact, the world that dinosaurs lived in was just absolutely covered in ferns because these other flowering plants weren't around yet. They kind of came around in the late Cretaceous. Now that might kind of tell you what the next big innovations are. They're going to be seeds and then flowers. About 360 million years ago, we see the first seeds. Whoa, it's tiny. So about 360 million years ago, we see the evolution of the first seeds, which are in gymnosperms, plants that are basically like a flowering plant but don't have true flowers. So this would be like pine trees, fir trees, all of your conifers, cycads, things like that. And seeds are amazing. The big improvement of seeds over spores is seeds can survive a lot longer without water. They can wait longer to germinate, in some cases for thousands of years, maybe more. And they can store a lot of nutrients to give the new organism a head start, right? A spore is tiny, or a seed contains many more cells that are basically just focused on providing nutrients to that baby plant, to that zygote, and to help it grow as quickly as possible to the point where it can start accessing sunlight and doing photosynthesis. The final innovation here is about 125 million years ago in the late Cretaceous. We finally see flowering plants. And we call those angiosperms. Oops, use a different color. Why not? Now, gymnosperm basically means naked seed, and angiosperm basically means seed within a vessel. So, for instance, flowering plants, the seed develops inside a fruit. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a big, juicy, tasty fruit like the ones that we eat, although those are, in fact, angiosperms. But it could be something really, a fruit could be something simple like a dried pod or something like that. Whereas gymnosperms, they just have the seeds kind of hanging out in things like cones, totally naked, exposed to the elements, that kind of thing. The amazing thing about angiosperms is once you start getting flowers, you can have coevolution with insects. And if you know anything about the biology of Earth, you'll know that it's absolutely full of insects, and you can have all these amazing different insect species that pollinate these flowers, that they get their nutrition from the flower gets basically an aid with its own sexual reproduction from the insects, and so this coevolution has produced all this kind of amazing diversity of flowering plants and insects. And in fact, if an alien were to come to Earth today and just look around, they would say this is a planet that's full of flowering plants and insects. These are two of the most populous life forms on Earth, particularly in terms of the number of different species. So yeah, this is the evolution of plants from anoxygenic bacteria all the way to flowering plants. Interesting thing about these flowering plants is 125 million years ago is actually very recent in the fossil record. So again, when there were dinosaurs, there weren't flowering plants, not until the very end when they were about to all go extinct. So flowering plants are younger than even mammals like ourselves. That's how incredibly recent the evolution of flowering plants is. But now, because they have a very successful way of reproducing, they're pretty much found all over the Earth. Now, again, evolution doesn't produce just one thing and that thing is the best and it takes over. All these other things are still around. So for instance, the oceans are full of cyanobacteria and algae. Really weird places like volcanic vents are full of these anoxic bacteria. Wet places tend to be full of bryophytes and pteridophytes, mosses and ferns. And then really kind of extreme environments where it's hard to keep leaves around, you find a lot of gymnosperms. So if you climb a mountain, at some point there's no leafy trees anymore. There's just conifers, gymnosperms. The taiga is full of gymnosperms, for example. So just because something's a more recent evolutionary innovation doesn't mean it replaces everything that comes before it. All of these things are still around on Earth because maybe they have a good strategy surviving in these different environments. Okay, and that should tell us something about our bryophytes. It's a great strategy for surviving in really wet environments. They don't need to waste a lot of time with specialized tissues like xylem, phloem, roots, flowers. They can just do photosynthesis and get soaked in water because it's all around them, especially in the wet times of year. Like right now, it's the fall where I live, and these pteridophytes and bryophytes, mosses and ferns, are just absolutely thriving. There's moisture everywhere, and they're growing like crazy. Okay. Let's talk about kind of the life cycle of these bryophytes. Many years ago, when I was a young biology student and Aristotle was my teacher, I'm kidding, I'm not quite that old, But many years ago, when I was a biology student, I would look at these diagrams of the life cycle of algae and bryophytes and things like that, and I would get really confused. But it's really not that complicated, so I'll draw it out my way, and I think you'll probably be able to understand that a little better than looking at the diagram in your Campbell textbook or something like that. Bryophytes have this really interesting life cycle where for part of their life they're haploid, they have one set of chromosomes, and part of their life they're diploid, they have two sets of chromosomes. Now that's actually true of us too. I was once haploid and now I'm diploid. I was haploid when I was an egg in my mom and a sperm in my dad. And then when those two came together to form the zygote, I took that one set of chromosomes from my mom, that one set of chromosomes from my dad, and now had two sets of chromosomes, and I spent the rest of my life as a diploid being, as I am today, hopefully, last I checked. With these bryophytes, and it's very similar to algae, that's not actually the case. They spend a lot of their life as a haploid individual. That would be kind of like us being an egg or sperm, but instead of just being one little haploid gamete cell big, they can be a full little organism. So let's take the example of liverworts. A liverwort is this kind of, the ones at least I've seen nearby, are these kind of leafy structures, and they're made of millions of cells, even though they're very small. Cells are even smaller. And they only have one set of chromosomes. So this liverwort is haploid. And we call this a gametophyte. Gamete for like sex cells, sperm and eggs. I think it comes from the word for marriage in Greek or something like that. And phyte for plant. So it's kind of like a gamete plant, a gametophyte. And these are basically the liverworts that we see. So when I was walking around my park seeing liverworts, I was seeing haploid plants, these gametophytes. Now at some point, as they mature, they can produce sexual structures just like many other organisms. And this is where they differentiate into both male and female plants. So some of these have the male chromosome and some of these have the female chromosome. At some point, these gametophytes will develop these kind of flower-like structures. Again, no flowers have evolved, but you can think of them as similar to flowers in the sense that they're sexual structures. And they look very similar to me, but I'm sure liverwort scientists can tell them apart. This one I think is the male one, and this one is the female one. I think the male one is often called an antheridium. Usually we use the term anther for pollen-producing structures in flowering plants. And the female one's called the archegonium, but I don't think you need to know that. Just know that these haploid plants, gametophytes, can grow these kind of sexual structures. Some are male, some are female. And just like with plants and with animals like ourselves, these male ones produce sperm. And then what happens is, remember, even though it kind of looks like these are big, remember these are tiny, tiny little liverworts along the ground. And so when the water comes and the big rains happen, the water kind of washes these little sperm cells onto the female part of the gametophyte, where the eggs are. And then the eggs are fertilized by the sperm. And then something really interesting happens. So again, this gametophyte has one set of chromosomes. This gametophyte has one set of chromosomes. So that sperm is one set, that egg has one set. They come together and they form something that's diploid. It has two sets of chromosomes, 2N. And we call that the sporophyte. And that's basically the next part of the life cycle of this liverwort here. Sporophytes look different depending on what each liverwort, but for the species I saw, they form these kind of little sacs underneath the archegonium, the female part of the flower. So these are all diploid parts that represent the next stage of the life cycle of this liverwort, and we call this the sporophyte. Again, this is the gametophyte. It's haploid. These are the sporophytes. They're diploid. And then the sporophyte, kind of like the name says, are full of spores. So at some point, they pop open and they release a bunch of little N spores, because meiosis happens inside this sporophyte, and during meiosis you go from a diploid cell to many, many haploid cells. Just like within humans, in our testes and ovaries, we go from diploid germline cells to haploid eggs and sperm, and that's basically what happened here. It makes a bunch of little haploid cells. And when these haploid cells land, they basically grow and become more gametophytes, little haploid organisms, and then they grow up. Eventually they create their own sexual structures, and then if fertilization happens, you get a new generation of sporophytes. So that's all very cool. There's an even neater thing about so many of these bryophytes that I saw, particularly these liverworts, and that is they can reproduce asexually. Now, most organisms, if they got to choose, would choose sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. And that's because if you have a bunch of kids with a partner, you mix your genes together and you get a bunch of different versions. And for the survival of your species, it's good to have as much diversity as possible because you don't know what the future is going to bring. There might be something that wipes out a specific version, and then you need another version that can survive. So for instance, in Europe, there are all kinds of versions of people. Some had genes that would give them resistance to the bubonic plague. When the bubonic plague happened, it was the people who were resistant that were more likely to survive. And so this diversity of genes within a population make it healthy and able to survive these kind of really difficult events that might happen. It's also what creates the diversity that allows natural selection to happen and create new species and take over new ecological niches and all that stuff. So sexual reproduction is always better than asexual reproduction because you can make a bunch of new versions and see how those are going to survive. Asexual reproduction is also cool because let's say it's hard to find a partner. As I said earlier too, this relies on the sperm going from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte. And so what these liverworts can do if they don't want to put that energy into sexual reproduction, or even just to hedge their bets as a backup, is they can do asexual reproduction. When I looked at the surface of my liverworts, I saw they had a bunch of these little cups on them. This is called a gemma cup. And inside that gemma cup are what look like a bunch of little eggs. It was really cool. Now, these aren't eggs. These aren't egg cells. Egg cells only exist kind of on the female gametophyte. What these are basically little plantlets, little baby versions of this plant. And again, when the rains come or when the stream raises or whatever happens, water will come in and it'll wash these little plantlets out of the gemma cup. And if they find a nice little spot, they'll grow and turn into a brand new gametophyte. So this one came from a male gametophyte, so it's also going to be a male gametophyte. So these bryophytes can do both sexual reproduction and also asexual reproduction, which is really cool. It's nice to have a backup. This is true in a lot of plants and algae, right? So most plants out in your garden or out in nature will be doing sexual reproduction, but there's so many plants that can also do this asexual reproduction as a backup or as a nice way to just produce lots of plants really easily without finding a mate. But again, most organisms will prefer, they maybe don't have feelings, but you know what I mean, to do sexual reproduction because it's a great way to create genetic variability, and genetic variability makes for healthy species and more evolution and diversity of life on Earth. Okay, so I found these Gemma cups to be very cool and interesting. I really like the way they look. And it's one of the things that visually attracted to me to these liverworts and made me want to do this video in the first place. If that seemed confusing, let me give you one more example of the life cycle of bryophytes, and this time we'll talk about mosses. So mosses are kind of exactly the same. Mosses, as you see them, as these kind of like ferny looking guys. Here's one, here's another. These are both, what you see out there, are both gametophytes. They both are only haploid, they only have one set of chromosomes. And this one over here, you might not know it, but this one is a male moss, and this one over here is a female moss. And mosses are even harder to tell the difference from one to the other than liverworts and hornworts, but scientists that study these things can tell, especially if they get a close enough look. So this moss over here, this haploid gametophyte, up at the top is going to have some sperm producing cells, and this one over here is going to have some egg producing cells. And again, I'm drawing them the same because they look the same to me, but someone who's in the know can probably tell the difference. And just like with our liverworts, they produce these little sperms and little eggs. And if a sperm is able to find its way to an egg, and again, typically that's through water. Our bryophytes kind of rely on water to feed their cells, but also to move the sperm to the egg. And that's why they only live in moist environments. But if water moves that sperm to an egg, it gets fertilized and becomes 2N. Here's where things get interesting. This little being here contains the cells from its mom, but also contains this set of chromosomes from its dad. This is now a sporophyte and not a gametophyte. These down here are both gametophytes. Remember, gametophytes are haploid organisms. Sporophytes are diploid organisms. So if you had to describe yourself, you would definitely say you're a sporophyte, as am I. We were only gametophytes, I guess, briefly when we were eggs and sperm, but even that doesn't really work because phyte means plant. So we're neither sporophytes nor gametophytes, but we are, like sporophytes, diploid. We have two sets of chromosomes. Okay, so what'll happen is the sporophyte on a moss will kind of grow as a big long stalk, and usually there'll be some kind of capsule on the end of that sporophyte where the spores all develop. And I just went looking in my backyard. Again, it's really wet where I live right now. It's the fall. And I saw a bunch of these sporophytes. I think they were maybe old sporophytes from earlier in the fall, or maybe even from the spring, because they had already bust open. And all of the little spores had already fallen out. So when that sporophyte matures, the little spores drop out. And these are kind of brand new little N gametophytes. And if one of them, maybe I'll do them in green actually. Let's imagine these are all green. And if one of them finds a spot where it can grow, it'll turn into a brand new little moss, and the whole cycle will continue. Now, some of these, remember, this is a diploid sporophyte, so it has a set of a set of chromosomes from its dad and a set of chromosomes from its mom. And so some of these little spores that it drops, some of these are going to be male, some of these are going to be female. It just depends which one's which. And then let's say this one's a female, it'll land and grow into a new female gametophyte. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit less confusing than the life cycles that you see in your textbook if you are looking at a textbook, but it's a really cool life cycle that these bryophytes have. Thanks for taking this weird walk with me down the strange world of bryophytes. It's probably something you never cared to learn about or never thought about it at all in your life, but now you know about, and that's pretty cool. Maybe next time you're walking and you see a moss or something that looks like a weird leaf, you'll look a little closer and maybe you'll see some gemmacups or some sporophytes or some sporangia or any of this weird stuff. In general, I've found the more I kind of look closely at the little things of the world, particularly insects, but also plants too, the more I'm amazed at how crazy and interesting this world is. So, might be a little bit esoteric, but now you know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.